Well, hello, welcome to the Horticulturalists from the depths of Stevens Harbour. I'm Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan, and we post a video every Friday. So don't forget to hit subscribe and the alert button to remind you each week when our next video comes up.
And if you're curious and have a question for Mr. Ryan, put it in the comments below and he will answer it in 60 seconds in our Monday short. But Stephen, the reason we are here are these beautiful bulbs at our feet. But let's go and talk to the people.
Yes, we're too far away.
What are we going to talk about today?
All right, well, we noticed when we were looking around for storylines that in fact it's late winter, and one of the things that cheer us up no end when it's cold and miserable like this are the narcissus or daffodils.
And you actually can just see the little spots of yellow just there.
Yeah. So we wanted to talk about some of the miniature species and hybrids that are available and talk about their use as garden plants and pot plants, and why I would opt for the little wee miniature ones as opposed to possibly to the great big King Alfred yellows or something like that.
Well, there you go. It is a brisk day, so I'm very happy that we have a lot of potted specimens to show you, and they're all in your polytunnel.
Yeah, so we'll be able to shelter from the wind any minute now.
Let's go.
All right.
All right, so here we are. It's warm, and there are some beautiful pots of little yellow magic here. So first of all, though, Narcissi.
Yeah.
Broad stroke.
Yes.
What, where, how, when?
Well, of course, it's a well-loved genus, and it's restricted basically to the Western Mediterranean area. There's some that grow in Morocco, there's others that grow right through Europe, some grow up into the mountains, up into the Alps in Europe, some are meadow plants from Spain and Portugal. So there's a diversity of habitats that the Narcissus come from. And of course, they've been popular garden plants for centuries.
So I didn't realize there was such a diversity of climate. So some of them are like full-on Mediterranean bulbs with a hot, dry summer.
Yep, some of them are like that. Some require a cool, almost alpine condition to grow well. So there's a huge diversity amongst them, but they're remarkably adaptable plants. As long as they get a proper cool to cold winter, most of them like to dry out a bit in the summer when they're dormant, because they are a lot of them from Mediterranean areas. But there's one or two, and we'll talk about one specific one, that is actually a damp meadow plant and doesn't like to in fact dry right out. So they're not all exactly tarred with the one brush.
Okay, let's start with the one that I spotted over in your little woodland moment over there. And have we got a potted
Yes, we
here?
do indeed. We have here probably one of the most intriguing of the genus, and that is, there we go, and that's Narcissus cyclamineus, meaning flower like a cyclamen, because it has the flared back petals.
It's truly extraordinary. Okay, so where is this one from?
Well, this one is from Spain and Portugal. It does grow in damp meadows and fairly cool conditions. And it was discovered quite some centuries ago, and then it disappeared and people thought it had gone extinct. It was rediscovered again about 100 years later. And in the interim, Gerard in his herbal had mentioned it even though he'd never seen the plant. Following up from him, other herbalists had said, well, it obviously doesn't exist. It's the unicorn of the Narcissus world. And then it was rediscovered again. And it's a bit of an outlier as far as the Narcissus is concerned. I mean, it breeds with a lot of the others, so it's been used a lot in breeding. And in fact, if you buy any hybrid daffodil that has flared back petals like that, it will have Narcissus cyclamineus in its breeding line.
Even though it might be much larger.
Oh yeah, some of the hybrids are quite big. They're virtually standard sized daffodils. But all the flared back petaled ones will be part of Narcissus cyclamineus in the breeding. And apart from the fact that the wild form is quite a tiny little plant, restricted in its natural habitat, it's become somewhat endangered in the wild through clearing and other sundry things. It makes a good little garden plant in a climate where you don't get dry summers. I use it here in semi-shade so that it stays in a spot where it's not too hot.
So this is the thing that surprised me, and in fact, we'll go and have a look at the clump that you've got, because the first thing I said was that is in a lot of shade for a narcissus, which I've always understood to need sunlight to prompt flowering.
Well, most of them do, but cyclamineus will grow perfectly well in semi-shade, but it has a couple of other characteristics that I have to say are not actually very useful ones when it comes to commercial plants.
Oh, the evil face of commerce.
Yes, exactly. Well,
you can't wring $1 out of it, Stephen.
Well, you can, but it's a lot more hard work, I find, the wild form of Narcissus cyclamineus than most other narcissus. And that's for several reasons. The main one being that the individual bulb does not, in fact, multiply very often. So you can have one bulb of it that could flower for years and years and years and keep flowering and only ever end up with the one bulb. So to get more plants of it, you need to have seed.
Right.
So I raise it from seed. It normally takes 3 years to flower from seed. I hand pollinate it because I don't think we have the appropriate pollinators here. So I get into the flower with a little twig and rattle the pollen around.
Wow, it's like vanilla propagation.
Yeah, it is rather. And it is a fabulous little plant, but yes, to get a good colony of it, you need to get self-sown seedlings. So it needs to set seed pods, and then you have to wait for about 3 years to get a flowering size bulb.
Okay, before we go and look at your colony though, obviously this is in a pot.
Yeah.
So all of these can be grown as pot specimens if you were going to, I guess, form a collection perhaps.
Oh yes, most narcissus will grow reasonably well in pots. They do need repotting on a regular basis, and they do need feeding because they will impoverish the potting mix fairly quickly. In general, if I'm growing them, I would actually probably repot most of them yearly. Into fresh potting mix, some slow release fertilizer in there. That way you can keep them bouncing along.
Bouncing along. Well, let's bounce outside into the bitter cold and go and see your clump of these in your natural habitat.
Yes, exactly. Well, as you can see, my little Narcissus cyclamineus down here are growing beautifully. They're under large evergreen and deciduous trees, and they've naturalized quite well because what I normally do is I hand pollinate them, as I mentioned before, but I collect seed to grow, and I always leave some seed to shed down onto the ground and come up of its own accord. Sometimes it's not to my favour or the Narcissus's favour, because some of them are now starting to germinate in amongst the cracks of the paving, which makes them rather at risk to be stood on. So I often dig those ones out first if I'm going to get some extras from my plants. So it's flowering its head off. There's lots of new buds coming as well. So over the next few days, I will hand pollinate them. Actually, giving them a little shake like that will often be enough, but I often put a little stick inside and move it around to loosen the pollen.
All right, Stephen, on to the next.
All right, Matthew.
That is in miniature.
Yeah, this is probably the smallest growing of all of the wild Narcissus, and it's known to all and sundry as Narcissus asturiensis, although it would seem that Kew now lists it as Narcissus cuniflorus.
Right.
And it is minute, and any of the hybrids that you get of miniature trumpet-like Narcissus probably have asturiensis in its breeding.
Yeah.
And it also comes from sort of Spain, Portugal area. So that's where it's native to. It probably grows in slightly drier areas than our previous one, the cyclamineus. But it is such a tiny and dainty little thing that you do have to be aware of it all the time. You can't just plonk it in the garden and walk away, because one, it'll get eaten by slugs and snails, and I think this one probably of all the Narcissus I've ever grown is the more difficult to manage in the ground. I think it's probably better as a pot plant.
As a pot plant.
Yeah.
So on that note then, the previous one was more of a shade tolerant plant.
Yeah.
Is this more of your classic full sun, dry summer?
It's probably intermediate. It's probably not one that I'd put in the hottest, driest spots I could find.
Yeah.
So it would be between Narcissus cyclamineus and some of your normal daffodils for its requirements. But being so small, it's just always under risk. And it, again, doesn't multiply fast, so you don't get colonies of it quickly.
I was going to ask, but does it? Do these bulbs, though, split?
You will find that you'll get some division from asturiensis in a natural way. But again, if you wanted to build up quantity of it, I would be hand pollinating it and raising seed batches of it as well.
Yeah. Now, this one is in quite a deep pot. So if we're looking at pot culture and you're going to collect these, what is the best way to actually grow them?
Well, I think most bulbs are actually better from the bulb's perspective in a deepish pot, because then they can get their roots down. They can sort of find their own level of depth that they want to be at, because some of them will pull themselves down a bit.
Yeah, that I always find that extraordinary that a bulb has that
Yeah, they have what
level
are called,
of free will.
Yeah, well, they're called retractile roots for a very good reason. But having said that, from an aesthetic point of view, these look far better in a more shallow container.
Yeah, unless you had 20 bulbs in a pot.
Yeah, well, even then, I'd still think aesthetically, because they're so tiny, a shallower pot then brings the bulbs and the pot more into scale.
Yeah.
So I probably wouldn't grow them in this sort of pot if I was wanting to show them off. And certainly you wouldn't put that on the show bench.
Fair enough. All right, Stephen, this to me looks like a perfect tiny daffodil.
And it is one of the many Narcissus asturiensis hybrids. As you can see, it's a little bit bigger than asturiensis itself.
Yeah.
And probably makes a better garden plant in lots of ways.
Yes.
The flowers sit up better, they're not as flat to the ground.
Yeah.
And I think they're gorgeous little plants. And in fact, I've got one here that's actually one of the really sort of sought after hybrids that was bred many, many decades ago by Mr. Alex Gray in England. And it's a little asturiensis hybrid called Candle Power. Now, it's only just come out, so it's a pale creamy yellow, but as the flower ages, this particular one, the flower goes virtually dead white.
Oh.
So it fades and fades and fades without actually looking faded. It actually turns white. And so Candle Power is quite a sought after cultivar. Again, slowish multiplying, so it takes time to build it up. And so therefore you'll always pay a reasonable price if you're trying to buy one of them.
Yes, there we are. This one is beautiful. Now, just looking at that aesthetically, so it's made a lovely sort of clump. Obviously, perhaps this bulb has divided. But they would look good in sort of rock gardens, in an area where you can sort of, I guess, frame them with the landscaping that you're using.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, I grow quite a number of them in my rock garden down in my own garden. And the good thing about growing them in a rock garden is if you've got large rocks and you've got gravel over it and what have you, these things can come up through that gravel, look gorgeous for the period they're there, but when they die down, you're not just looking at bare ground, you've got gravel sitting over the soil, and so things can come and go without the bed looking completely sort of devoid.
Yeah. Well, talking of your garden, I think we should now hop down the mountain and go and look at the ones that are in your garden.
Yes, what a good idea. Now, I might not be wandering lonely as a cloud that floats on high, but I have got some Narcissus here that is drifting nicely in the garden. And I got this one originally as Narcissus Fernandesii, which is one of the Spanish ones. And it's in the group of Narcissus that are botanically known as jonquillas. And jonquillas always have multiple flowers to the stem. They're normally short trumpeted. And they are usually highly perfumed. So they're well worth growing for all those reasons. And unlike some of the other ones we had a look at earlier, this one does seem to multiply with gay abandon. So it's worked its way through the bed here in areas that I didn't originally plant it, and even right down into the edge of the driveway. So it's a pretty little plant, lovely for picking for posies, and it's the other group of Narcissus. Now, Narcissus as a genus is anything that you could class as a daffodil or a jonquil or what have you. And of course, we all remember Narcissus, who died whilst looking at his reflection in a pond. And I believe that might well be where the name came from. Daffodil is an Old English name, and I'm not quite sure of its derivation. The same with jonquil. And the terms aren't able to be swapped. Narcissus is the genus, daffodils are one group, they're the trumpet type yellow, generally yellow flowered, but there's lots of colours now. And what is known as jonquils by most people are much bigger growing plants, but also have multiple flowers, and they're in a group called tazettas. So there's the different groups within the genus, and those who are aficionados will understand what I'm talking about. The rest of you probably don't need to care. Now, Matthew, remember when we were talking about Narcissus cyclamineus, the little one with the donkey ear-like petals that curl back, and I said that the hybrids thereof often exhibit the same sort of characteristics. And here we have one of the little hybrids that I've had in the garden for years, and it hasn't multiplied all that well, so it's obviously inherited some of that from Narcissus cyclamineus as well. And this is a little hybrid that you rarely see around for sale called Snipe. And I think it's a charmer. Its flowers turn almost white when they've been fully out for a while. And you can see on this one here how the petals curl back. I have to say though, I still think the wild species itself has more elegance and charm about it than virtually any of its hybrids. But I'm very, very fond of Snipe as a little daffodil. And of course, this little daffodil is perfectly happy here in my rock garden. So I've got it all the way up a driveway. It's rough paddock boulders with lovely moss and lichens growing all over them. The soil was prepared quite well initially so that there's good soil under there. The bulbs were planted and then the bed was covered in gravel. So the white gravel, once the bulbs die down, keeps the bed looking dressed. So there are times of the year when certain areas of this rock garden are a mass of flowers, and at other times of the year it's basically rocks and gravel, but it still looks fine. So it's a good way to grow these plants. I don't have to dig, I don't have to fiddle much. I get the occasional weed I have to manage, but otherwise this garden to a large extent looks after itself, and it's never watered.
Okay, the most famous, well, I'm saying it's the most famous because I am, you know, the rank amateur.
Yes.
This is one I am familiar with.
Yes, well, at least that group.
That form of flower,
yes. Now, these are the Narcissus bulbocodiums, and bulbocodiums are commonly known as hoop petticoat daffodils.
Yeah.
And you can see that in the case of these, their trumpet is the major floral part, and the petals have become quite reduced at the back of the trumpet. So they've got quite a different look about them, and they also have this very fine rush-like foliage, whereas most of the other daffodils have a much broader, flatter leaf. So the bulbocodiums are quite unique.
And where's this from?
The bulbocodiums grow in Spain, I think across into Europe further. They also grow in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. So I saw some bulbocodiums in full bloom there when I was trekking in the Atlas Mountains many years ago. And they're a very confusing group of narcissus because they are all very similar, and it's hard to know where one species starts and the next one finishes. This one's actually a garden hybrid. This was produced by a chap in Tasmania called Rod Barwick, who's very good at producing miniature narcissus. And this is one of his bulbocodium hybrids, which he's called Mitimoto, for reasons I've no idea.
Like the Pearl Company.
Well, I think that's Mikimoto, isn't it?
Yes, what's this called?
Mitimoto.
Oh, Mitty.
Yeah, so I've no idea why Rod did that, but he does have some weird names for his dwarf narcissus. He's actually got what he calls his series of detectives. So he named them after Sherlock Holmes and Miss Marple and all those well-known fictitious people.
Okay.
So there's some really weird names out there. But anyhow, he's doing some wonderful work, and this is one of his very good bulbocodium hybrids.
Now, I think you have told me that these do like a bake in summer.
Yes. Most of them bulbocodiums do like to get quite nice and warm and dry in the summer, albeit they don't want to be too shallow, so they're not like a narine bulb that you want to bake on the surface. They need to be buried. And you need to be selective on which bulbocodiums you grow, because some are actually quite shy flowering anyway. So sometimes you can end up with a bulbocodium that multiplies like fury, and you end up with a garden full of rushy leaves and hardly ever any flowers. If you end up with one that just doesn't like your soil or your conditions and doesn't flower well, get rid of it and try a different bulbocodium that might well actually work better for you.
Okay, because I've got a pot full, Stephen. I think I'm in the 3rd year. Lots of foliage, never a flower.
Oh, well, if you could get it out into the ground in a nice little warm sunny spot, maybe it might start flowering, but it doesn't sound to me like you've got a particularly floriferous variety, so you might need to move on to another form of bulbocodium.
Okay, I might just liberate them somewhere.
Yes, well, yes, what a good idea. Give them to somebody that you're not that fond of.
Well, Stephen, I have loved our tiptoe, not romp, through the fields of miniature narcissi. They're really gorgeous. This one is stunning.
Yeah, and I have to say one thing we haven't really covered is why I particularly like these as opposed to the larger ones.
Why do you, Stephen Ryan?
Well, there's several reasons for it. One is, of course, these make much better rock garden plants and edging plants and things than the big ones. The big ones, of course, are much more prone to being damaged by wind and weather because at this time of the year that's exactly what you expect.
Which is what's happening right now.
And so I think the miniature narcissus, and also when they're dying down, their foliage is smaller, it's daintier, so therefore it doesn't make such an overt sort of mess as they go down. So I think the little ones are great garden plants and definitely worthwhile looking out for.
Well, there you go. And what is worth looking out for is is what we're doing next week.
Yeah, exactly. So don't forget to hit subscribe and the alert button to remind you of our next video. And goodness knows what that will be.
I just hope it's warmer, Stephen. But anyway, it's boring to talk of the weather. If you've got a question for Steve and Ryan, do put it in the comments below and say where you're from, and we'll try and answer it in our Monday Shorts.
Yes, please do. And don't forget to tell me where you're from, because it does add context.
It does indeed. Well, the context from us is it's over, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week.
All right, bye all.